Lou Cody. I'm Head of Comms at Sage. Really happy to be hosting tonight's event as part of the ESRC's Festival of Social Science and in collaboration with the Academy and the Campaign for Social Science. And so I'm immediately going to kick tonight off and hand over to Sharon Witherspoon, who's Head of Policy at the Academy of Social Sciences, to give you a bit of an introduction.
Thank you very much, Lou. Yes, I'm Head of Policy at the Academy of Social Science, and this is one of a number of activities we undertake in what's been a very long-standing and very welcome partnership with SAGE, not only to do events, but to actually do some research about why social science matters. And let me just say quickly, the Academy of Social Science promotes social science for public benefit. We're not a trade union for social scientists. We're actually saying social science matters for what it delivers to the public. We've got about 1,300 fellows. We have members with 43 learned societies. It's a very broad definition of social science. And the Campaign for Social Science, which is our more public-facing voice, is part of the Academy. So we work to remind people why social science matters, that STEM subjects aren't the only thing, and that you do sometimes want objective evidence about social problems and social issues, and this is something that social scientists can do. So we're supported by a coalition of universities, learned societies, and private sector organizations. But one reason I couldn't resist when offered the chance to say a couple of words in introduction is one of our latest projects with SAGE was about the future of work for social scientists, if I may say that, so positive prospects. And it's a reminder that not everybody who does social science as an undergraduate degree or has postgraduate training, they don't end up in academia. In fact, most don't. And that's a good thing for the world because they bring their experience, their expertise, and their skills to a range of issues which are valued by the economy and are useful to a whole set of public policy issues. So we have copies of this report here, which, as you'll see, was sponsored by SAGE. But I want to just say a couple of things. I mean, you're here because this is a festival of social science. So I think many of you will say, I have some vague understanding of what it is. Most people don't. They think of STEM sciences, natural and physical scientists, and then they think of economics or finance or anthropology or archaeology or geography or sociology. They don't see that we group these as the social sciences because they're about human beings, human behaviors, human interactions in a very profound way. And we're spending a lot of time working with people to remind them that even in the grand challenges that clearly have a science dimension, climate change, health, obesity, aging, social sciences really matter. And they don't just matter because they help us nudge individuals to do things. That's a very fashionable view now. But they matter because they help us think smarter about taxation, regulation, how to make the world a better place. What we're also increasingly keen to get across is that those people who study social sciences at undergraduate, postgraduate, even secondary school level, A levels, it provides generalizable skills in analysis, and it actually provides some subset of knowledge. And so, you know, again, what we go through in the report is about 4 out of 10 undergraduates graduate from university with a social science degree. Now, this is a broad definition, but it needs to be because, like all of these categorizations, it's fuzzy around the edges. I never thought architecture, building, and planning, which is a statistical category, was a social science. But you know what? Planners actually do quite a lot of social scientists. Increasingly, we've got some case studies coming out next year, increasingly we find architecture does because they need to think, how do people use spaces? How can we help them use them more healthily? One of the things we're very keen to get across, and many of you will have seen this, is this narrative in the press that only STEM degrees bring value to the economy and only STEM degree students have good employment prospects. This is not true. It is true that there are differences by discipline. Economics undergraduates have the highest salaries going when they immediately graduate from universities. Economics is definitely a social science. I'm not applauding that, I'm noting it as a fact. But to say that the employment prospects are notably different across all social sciences isn't helpful. So what we've done here is, from official government data, again, all the sources laid out in the book, just looked at what happens with arts and humanities, social sciences, and STEM. This isn't the time for me to do a big talk. All I'll say is the further you parse this down, the more you realize there's about as much variation within STEM and the social sciences as there is between. And the big outlier is the creative arts, where people do get lower salaries for a very long time on average, or humanities work allied to the creative arts, but not only is it clearly of some public value, it brings in huge amounts of money to the exchequer. So what we're trying to do is to say you cannot judge the worth of something simply because of salaries. Social work is another good case, which has very low salaries over time, but who would not say that's socially worthwhile? But the averages are not that different. We also remind people that this is not from us, this is from the British Council, about 60% of global leaders have undergraduate degrees in social science. And it isn't all law. You know, it includes economics, it includes political science, and it's not all to do with government. So again, we give further detail, but it's a reminder that social science is interesting, fascinating, yields insights, but it's hard to say it's not useful too. So the final thing, and the hook into, or the segue into our illustrious panelists, who I'm looking forward to hearing, is we did do some work about the future of work and employment prospects for social science undergraduates. And it's clear, because of facts I've just cited, that they have skills that make them valuable to employers. They can analyze complex situations, they know something. But it is also clear, and we document this in various ways, as the nature of work changes, they're likely to need to enhance their number and data skills. That's not so that they can do work that will later become, driven out by AI or whatever, but it's so they can interpret it. It's so they can understand what it's really saying and not take it for granted. And we present a lot of evidence that this is already clear now, that it's not saying those are the only skills that matter, but it is saying we do need more social scientists who have those skills. I won't spend any time on this, but we know this from employers too. So the key thing we're trying to say is that all of us are going to need to engage with the issues of the future of work, but I particularly feel passionately about the fact that's true for younger people, because they need to think not in a crystal ball sense. I know exactly what's going to happen. As a very famous social scientist once said, he who gazes into the crystal ball must be prepared to eat ground glass. So I think most of what we'll be hearing about are not a prediction about X% of the population is going to be doing this, but about the big structural pressures that we all need to think about. But when I'm talking to younger undergraduates, it's saying you need to think about your toolkit. And for those of you that are interested, there are a range of ways that you can look at your skills toolkit in terms of number and data skills. So I think that's everything I wanted to say. Welcome, thank you for coming, and I look forward to hearing what the panel has to say. Thank you, Lynn.
Thanks. Sharon, thank you so much. Such a great introduction, and really good to hear about what you're doing with the Academy and the Campaign for Social Science. So just a couple of housekeeping things before I tell you a little bit, really briefly, about how SAGE is kind of involved with this, why we're running this event. On the side of the screen, you will see there are some hashtags and some Twitter handles. Please do follow us. Feel free to tweet along as we go along tonight. So moving on. So why is SAGE doing this? So we obviously are an independent academic publisher that's really interested in the social sciences. And one of the things that we've been doing this year is really focusing on the impact of social science. How do we make social science have a greater impact in the world around us? And so this has been moving from looking at how do we measure and recognize that impact. So for example, we released a white paper earlier this year looking at the metrics for research impact in the social sciences, moving beyond citation counts, looking at how we can really have a structure of measuring the impact of social science that is different from the natural sciences. We're also looking at things like how we can help social science to have a greater impact. So we're asking, hopefully there's some social scientists in the room, but we're asking social scientists to write us their stories about how their work, their research has had impact on our website social science space. So please do feel free to go and check that out or come and talk to me afterwards if you're interested in that. And also, earlier this year, we launched a book series called What Do We Know and What Should We Do About? ... One of which was on the future of work. And Melanie Sims, who's the author of that, is here in our panel tonight, so fantastic to have her here. And my only bit of sales for tonight, but you can use the code UK19author for 25% off. That's just, a bit of added value as a publisher that we give. And we've got a few more titles from that series coming out soon. So that's all I'm going to kind of like tell you in terms of what Sage does. So let's move on in terms of meeting our panel tonight. So first of all, Melanie, obviously the author of our book. She's Professor of Work and Employment at the University of Glasgow Adam Smith Business School and the author of our book on the future of work. Then we have Karen Gregory. She's a digital sociologist, ethnographer, and lecturer in the Department of Sociology at the University of Edinburgh and Programme Director of the MSc in Digital Society. Sana Oyumpeda, which I hope I said right, researcher and DPhil student at the University of Oxford and doctoral student at the Alan Turing Institute. And finally, we have Alex Wood, who's lecturer in the Sociology of Work at the University of Birmingham. Please can I have a big round of applause for our panel tonight. Before we kick off and hear from the panel, we're going to ask you some questions. So you'll see on the side of the screen, there is a thing up here, it's called menti.com. If you go and get your phone out and you type this code into it, you will have the ability to interact. And what we're going to be doing over the course of the panel is you will have the ability to ask questions, and as they come up, I will either put them to the panel as we're discussing things, or if they don't get asked then, we've got a Q&A right at the end of the event, so we'll hopefully get through as many as we can then. So we wanted to know, what do you do for work? Obviously, this is going to kind of affect what we're going to be talking about tonight, because I think that depending on who you are, you have very different interests in what the future of work is going to be. So really interested to see who we've got in the room. Good mix. Lecturers, okay. Lots of communications people. Wow, okay, we've got a really good mix. Really interesting. Yeah, so researchers, sales. Okay, and then on to the next question we've got. What do you, when you think of the future of work, what immediately springs to mind? Unemployment is the biggest one, really interesting. Automation, we've got reskilling, flexibility, autonomy, complexity, restrictive, platform economy, family, innovation, boredom. That's an interesting one. Automation coming up as a big one. Okay, so hopefully that gives all of you a little bit of an insight into what people are thinking about when they're here tonight. Great, thanks very much. So we'll just flip back into the presentation. And the way that we're going to structure the discussion tonight is around the themes of the chapters of Melanie's book. So we're going to ask the panelists, what do we know about work as it is today? Then we're going to ask them, what do we know about the future of work? And then finally, we're going to ask them the really tricky question, what should we do about the future of work? So let's kick off with, what do we know about work? Sana, I'm going to go to you first.
Sure. And I think all of our panelists are going to have a lot to say about this. So I'm going to start with something very easy to grasp. So maybe initially when you're thinking about work, you think of something like a person starting in a firm, working in this firm for several decades and then retiring from that firm, and that's kind of their career. This is also called a standard employment relationship. And a lot of our labor market institutions are still structured around this kind of standard employment relationship, but this no longer is necessarily kind of the main way of people working. There's a lot more of non-standard forms of work. And also the different countries are quite connected in terms of employment and employers. We do have a rather globalized world where many production activities are also organized as global production chains that take place in various different countries or locations in the world. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail yet, but we are even starting to talk about a planetary labor market where you can really think about in planetary terms that you can have an employer and an employee perhaps anywhere on the planet that could be working together. So I believe that this is how the world of work is looking like right now.
Pick up on that a little bit. One thing we know about work is that workers are increasingly feeling insecure. As Sanna's suggesting, new forms of employment have also maybe only look like a small percentage of the population working currently in those non-standard forms of employment, but more broadly, that workers feel that the future is not certain, that where you're working today may not be where you're working in 5 years, and that there's an unclear plan there. Along with that uncertainty has come a great deal of privatization and risk, and that people start to feel that they are continually searching for work, looking for work, and putting a lot of time into something that not necessarily be paying off. And I think as a result of that, work is no longer an esoteric category in our lives. It's no longer simply a academic interest or something that we have to think about in terms of labor markets and statistics, but in many ways is creeping, this conversation is creeping into almost everyone's lives. And as maybe if you look maybe 15 years ago, people had thought this was a kind of question that was resolved. Trade unions had been put in their places in some ways. There was a free market that was going to employ us all in all these kinds of creative capacities. And the age of the factory was over. We're moving into a new kind of age of production. I would say no longer esoteric, and that future no longer resolved. Work is back. If you look, I think a really good, nice way of seeing this is that many newspapers had fired or let go of their labor reporters over the years. This used to be a standard component of newspapers. It no longer has been for many years, but it is creeping back, and I think it's because we are all starting to try to figure out what this future of work is going to look like.
I broadly agree with some of those comments, but I also want to remind us that there are a lot of continuities. So one of the things that I'm really keen to emphasise, and I think gets under-examined in a lot of discussions about the future of work, is change. Actually, a lot of the core features of work haven't changed that much for a very long time. Most of us spend most of our adulthood going outside our domestic setting to sell our time, our skills to someone else who's not us, so some sort of employer, perhaps not technically in the legal sense of the word, because many of our legal institutions haven't responded particularly quickly to some of the changes in work, but most of us don't work for ourselves, most of us work for someone else. And so that basic challenge at work of our employer getting us to spend our time, skills and energy in the way that they want us to spend that time and not in the way we want to spend that time, that essential management problem exists, will continue to exist, and is really at the core of that exchange of labour, technically labour power for money. So whilst a lot of things have changed, work still looks remarkably similar in a lot of ways to certainly my parents' generation, actually indeed my grandparents' generation, and probably the generation before them. There are changes of who works. Those have been facilitated by societal changes, particularly around women remaining in the labour market, particularly middle-class women staying in the labour market. Working-class women have long stayed in the labour market, even after children, but middle-class women staying in the labour market. And also what we do at work has changed a bit, and this massive change from a manufacturing base, particularly in this country, to a service base. And that is very important, I think, when we think about the future of work, which I'll talk about more in a minute. So I want us not to forget the continuities as well.
Yeah, thanks. I think, I'll build a bit on what Mel was saying, actually, and this issue of control. But in discussing control, maybe I'll do what social scientists like to do and deconstruct the question a little bit. Because I think what's really important is to understand the difference between work, and by work, what I mean is that it's any activity that's productive and can include kind of voluntary activities that we're just doing for personal self-development, and labour or paid work. And paid work or labour is something that we're doing in order that we can survive and we can reproduce ourselves. So that means that kind of labour inevitably involves a slightly negative element to it. And we therefore have to be induced to do that work. Otherwise, we'd be doing something else. I'd be going rock climbing instead of working in a factory for example, or at least I'd change the manner in which I was doing that work. And so I think kind of the reason why we then engage in paid work is because of the carrots it provides us, that it provides us with pay, it provides us with material rewards, it provides us with symbolic rewards. But we also have to be controlled when we're doing it to ensure that we're actually doing it, as Mel says, in the way that the employers want us to be doing it. And I think, therefore, control is a really central thing to understand when we're going about doing paid work. And it really impacts on lots of other working conditions in terms of the form that control takes, what that then means for then how we're undertaking work in the workplace. And so that then raises the question of kind of what determines control. And I think personally, really, it's kind of a combination, an interaction between the bargaining power that Labour has vis-a-vis capital, the employers, but also the particular technologies which are being used in particular workplaces. And I think both of those things have actually, despite the continuity of this importance of control, both of those things have really changed quite a lot in terms of the bargaining power that many lower skilled workers have, but also the sorts of technologies that we're using in the workplace.
We didn't rehearse this, I promise.
It's interesting as well, like one of the things that Sharon said was about not being a trade union for social science. Like, does anyone want to sort of chip in on that? Because you're talking about like control and bargaining power between different entities.
So in the book, one of the things I argue is the reason I think we've got a particular panic, and I do think about it as a panic, a sort of anxiety and really deep concern in the UK, but also in the US, is because we've lost that say in what the future of work looks like. And if you look at settings where there has been able to be more of a negotiation about what the future of work is, and that could be, for example, if you look at the way the NHS has changed and integrated technology, taking on board the collective views of their workers, but you also see it in for example, German manufacturing settings is often used as an example, and one that I've used in the book. You can see that it is perfectly possible to change work really fundamentally, but with a negotiated outcome, so that the way that work changes is negotiated and to some degree agreed and consented to. The skills are thought about in a much more flexible way. The reskilling, if you need to reduce the size of your workforce, how that's done, and then that can be done over time. And I think that when you lose that voice, and particularly that collective voice, it becomes a site of real anxiety, because it becomes a way for, it becomes a space where we're having change that privileges our employers. And I think that's where we are, and it's why it's such an anxiety at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, I'd agree again. And I think also the fact, if you have the decline of collective regulation of the workplace, and this move towards this more individualized bargaining between workers and employers, it then leads to more inequality. Because if you have skills which are very scarce and in demand, then you can individually negotiate, and you might be able to get paid very well, have very good job quality and good pay. Whereas if you don't have those scarce skills, if you can't individually bargain, then you're going to lose out. And that's, I think, what we've seen is that what trade unions did, and internal labour markets and other forms of collective regulations, which still exist to a greater extent in other European countries, it meant that people who didn't have really scarce skills could have significant bargaining power through creating kind of collective organisations. And that then has the decline of that then hollows out the occupational structure. You don't have those people in the middle who didn't have scarce skills but could still get good quality jobs anymore. And instead we have people who have very good quality jobs, and we have people who have very bad quality jobs.
I was just going to add to that before I moved to the University of Edinburgh, I worked in a large public university in New York City where I taught labor studies. And there's a collision happening here where students have really learned to think of themselves as individual workers and potentially, maybe if they make it, entrepreneurs. And that we are actually, I think back to your point about the role of the social sciences, is that fundamentally we need to teach this history. there's a bit of a narrative that the individual can sort of figure this out. And if you do the right things, you get the right skills, you learn to code, you go to the right school, you compete in this very neoliberal kind of individual subjectivity, you create yourself productively, continually, ready for work. Somehow that this will sort itself out for you. And I think we haven't quite, as a discipline, done a service to the history of labor and to explain to students how we have gotten in this point. I mean, that is also a historical issue, but what those labor histories mean for people, because I think where sociology, especially I'm a sociologist, can begin to really have this larger conversation around impact is to trace out those histories, both good and bad. I think we have to be really clear. The history of labor in the US and the UK is fraught. To Melanie's point, I think one of the things we know now about the future of work is we cannot center a very particular worker who looks like a white male factory worker. That was not the beginning of work. We have to begin to start having this conversation of different histories of labor. And I think really to bring back that sociological focus on collectivity. That alone, I think sometimes you can see students' eyes almost go, oh my God, it's not just me, me against the world. So, yeah.
And also maybe just to take a slightly different viewpoint into that topic in particular, I don't know how many of you are interested in emerging economies beyond the US and the UK where we're sitting today. Obviously, a lot of what we're talking about pertains to the global north, if that's the term that you would like to use here, and to formal labor markets where these labor market institutions are in place and you have things like trade unions. I am mainly researching the other perspective from the global south, and of course the reality there is that a lot of the work that gets carried out is still largely in the informal economy, and there you don't have many of these similar labor market institutions in place at all. And what's, I believe, really interesting, even though there is this kind of erosion of the formal employment relationship in many of the global north countries, and you could almost term that as a new informality, as the distance between the employer and the employee kind of grows a little bit. What this then gives space to might be new governance models, which now could be applying to both areas and to be dealing with this kind of informal work and formal work and sort of the nexus between the two of those. So there might be also these kinds of opportunities, in particular for social science students, as policy and governance solutions are something that I think we saw in our employment statistics that might be in particular where social science students are directed to and are going to be delivering great work at.
Yeah. And can I just say something about employers as well, because I think it's very important that when we think about the future of work, we don't just think about ourselves as employees, that we actually also think about the decisions that employers are making. I think it's really important. The reason I'm particularly interested in the UK is because that's what we were actively told to focus on in the book in Venice. I think you're absolutely right to encourage us to think more broadly, but we were explicitly asked to think about the UK when we were writing the books. In the UK, of course, this point about being a service economy. So if we think about the kinds of jobs that is, that's often very low skill, low margin, low wage work. Low skill is problematic, but certainly low wage and low margin jobs. And when we think about the decisions that employers are facing in those kinds of settings, for example, in our supermarkets, because that's a setting we all know, employers are certainly trying to automate various parts of those jobs, certainly tasks within those jobs. So they're increasingly trying to train us as customers to do our own checking out. But I think it's really important that we separate the tasks within a job from the actual job, the parceling up of the job. Creating a job as a parcel of tasks is a really constructed process. Someone somewhere in history thought about which tasks went together into being a supermarket worker. And some of those tasks can be automated more easily than others. Probably most of them could be at some point. But there's a whole load of tasks within that set of activities, which actually at this stage can't easily be automated. So driving the wagon from the warehouse to the shop. At the moment, yes, there are lots of experiments with that, but it can't easily be done. And so if we think about this as choices that employers are making about how to parcel up sets of tasks into jobs, then I think that's a much more helpful way of thinking about the future of work, because it means that we separate out the different processes. And when we're in low wage, low margin economy, there's an incentive for employers to use workers because they're cheap and they're easy to hire and fire. So the cost to employers of automating many of those processes simply isn't worth it, even if it could be done. So the amount that you pay a wagon driver in the UK makes it not worth investing in that kind of technology, certainly the amount that you pay many supermarket workers. And we've seen this. My favourite example is car washes. In my lifetime, car washes have gone from an entirely automated service to an entirely human service. Why? Because they're spaces where it's very difficult to enforce labour regulation, very difficult to enforce minimum wages. We know there's a lot of sharp practices, including modern slavery. And in those spaces where labour is so cheap and so easy to exploit, then it makes no sense for employers to invest large amounts of money in machinery instead. And that's a very sad part of our economy, but it exists.
But just at least in New York, also a site of organizing.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
so some of the, there's histories of work that we think are over. Oh, it's going to be difficult to organize low-wage workers or to organize marginal workers or in fields that have never been organized before. I mean, as Alex can talk about as well, we're starting to see really militant and resurgent trade unionism or even beyond trade unionism action happening in some of these spaces. And car washers in New York City have been a case study that people teach for many years. So.
Okay, so as we're starting to talk about automation and moving on, let's move on to sort of the next section and talk about what do we know about the future of work. And one of the questions I wanted to ask is you talk about service economy, and in your book you talk about emotional aesthetic labour, and I find that a really interesting concept. The fact that I used to work at a fish and chip shop. And I also actually used to be a door host at TGI Fridays, which is a perfect example of emotional labour. Because I had to be extremely happy and I just wanted to kill every single person who walked in the door. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think it's just an interesting concept.
So emotional labour isn't when you go to your in-laws' house and have to pretend to be nice to them. That is a form of emotional work. You're certainly doing some work, but it's not emotional labour in the sense that we mean it in academia. We're interested when we're talking about emotional labour in when your employer is getting something out of you for doing that work. So being nice to a customer and therefore getting income for your employer. So it requires some of the similar skills that you'd need to go to your in-laws and be nice. But it's for your employer's benefit. And we know from all kinds of research that it is exhausting, it demands takes huge toll on people who do it. They find it psychically extremely problematic, often coming out in ways that are very, very difficult for them personally. And frontline service work inevitably to some extent it requires this kind of labour, and it is hard work and very exhausting for often very, very, very low rates of pay. It's an area where actually the customer often notices if you withhold this kind of labour, because if you go to if the TGI door host is not nice to you, you will actually probably notice that as the customer. And so it's a very difficult space for employers to regulate, but it's a really, really important space in the service economy. And care workers, medical workers find it hugely challenging, but working in a shop or a restaurant, those of us who've done it, and actually those of us who just deal with the public know how difficult it is.
And in terms of looking at automation and sort of the future of work, how does sort of automation affect things like that, where
Well, it's nearly impossible to automate that kind of thing. So you have to train your customers to engage differently. I mean, and we know this if we look, say, at banking, which again in my lifetime has become a much more automated service, and we've lost to a large extent that personal interaction. And there are pros and cons of that. But the banks have taken 20 years to train us to engage with them in that way, and we can see the supermarkets doing it at the moment. And some people really miss it. Personally, I don't care whether I go to my branch and have a chat with the teller, but my nan sure as hell did, and she refused to engage. My mum is somewhere in the middle, so they've had to train us as customers to work in particular ways. And
the flip side of that is that emotions and affect and this kind of labor is very hard to measure. If you smile at me when you open the door, it's hard for me to say, oh, that was 13 units of emotional labor. But digital technologies have built this logic into many of them. So we're starting to see the normalization of metrics and reputation scores and performance metrics. And I always think rather than a robot taking your job, it's that we will work alongside these technologies which rate and rank us and which have incredible power in our lives to hire and fire us, or in my work on delivery providers, to delete you. And that will start to become something that spreads across the platform economy, across gig work, across new forms of work and digital work. And that, how will this is something I think the trade unions, for example, it's not even really on their radar about what to do about this, because these things creep in through little things like, well, we just want to try something. We want to put a little sensor under your desk so we can see if, how the heating works in your building. It's all kinds of, new speculative technologies, but this logic of rating and ranking, but of measuring to make it profitable at some level. And just a footnote to this, if you're really interested in metric and measure, keep an eye on what's happening in classrooms, because the world of the classroom and the world of work are also moving along this continuum. And a lot of the really, I think, advanced and speculative technology is coming into students to train them to be workers who know that they are perpetually surveilled, monitored in this way, and that these metrics matter, that there's something real about them. And I think as social scientists, we really want to take a lens to that, because what does it actually mean to monitor your eye movements for attention, or to turn some kind of empiricism into a real qualitative metric that can have this kind of power in a worker's life?
And one of the greatest acts of solidarity and sometimes disruption you can do is to press the little green smiley button whenever you see the little green smiley button, or rate your Uber driver 5, even if you weren't that impressed, because it matters to them in ways. It will have control effects on them in ways that we as the customer won't even see.
You mentioned Uber. Should we move on to the platform economy?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say something about emotional
go for it.
labour. Just that I think it's also interesting, emotional labour, because it creates often a contradiction which workers can use for resistance. So for my PhD, I got a job at I nearly said the company, at a very large UK retailer that I call Partnership Co. And there, in our training, we were shown a video, and the person doing the training said, "This video is to remind you that this company wants you to act like a robot, but also not act like a robot when you're treating customers." And so then my co-workers and workers I interviewed then said how on the checkouts, if they didn't like a manager, one thing they could do is slow down on the checkout, and they had rates at which they were meant to be scanning objects. But then if the manager complained, they could say, "Oh, well, what do you want me to do? Say, shove off, Marjorie, I can't talk to you now. I've got to scan 5 items a minute." And so workers then all use this collectively to kind of sanction managers who were bullying them by all kind of collectively slowing down and emphasizing this emotional element of their labor. And I think you see similar things in call centers where workers, again, might have to follow a script, but that really reduces the quality of the work, of the emotional labor. And so there's often this conflict between quantification and the qualitative elements of emotional labor.
Definitely. In my PhD, I looked at how unions can use that to organise, which is really interesting because they can get into those spaces sometimes, which is really interesting. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, no, I would actually just loop back to the whole point about education that you were kind of touching upon earlier. So in the end of last year, me together with a couple of co-authors wrote this report for the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI, on the future of work and kind of what are some of the emerging research themes, some of the key research themes within there, and then kind of taking a particular look into data science as well. And just one of those themes that kind of we put a lot of focus on was the specific challenges of the future of work for the younger generations. Obviously, the aging generations do face challenges as well, but what we really wanted to focus on was kind of millennials and then Generation Z coming after them, because, and then this kind of goes back to the point of education systems, because many of the jobs of the kids who are now in elementary school that would be working on when they get to the labor market have not really even been invented yet, right? So the way that they will have to be able to learn through their educational systems is to kind of forget, unlearn, and then relearn again, and kind of be this scientist approach almost, rather than having some instructed and taught way of thinking about the world. So that was just a specific point to loop back to there. I thought that that's a really interesting discussion to then think about the socio-emotional skills that many of those jobs that will be surviving automation, as some of our estimates seem to suggest, are going to be characterized by. I encourage all of you to download the report. It's openly available on the website of the Turing, but just to kind of share some of the key findings that we kind of wanted to crystallize into in terms of what the future of work is for us, or we kind of conceptualize it as, is that you often kind of have this discussion about utopia or dystopia related to the future of work. Either we're going to have a lot of free time and leisure time, or the robots are going to take over our jobs and it's all going to be terrible. But what we kind of felt reviewing many documents about this instead was that rather inequality is going to increase between countries and also within countries. And that this is something that perhaps the policy effort should be focused on, and a lot of research should be focused on. And to also just think about, and I think this is something that Melanie really agrees with in her book, that it's not some kind of predefined future of work that we are headed towards like a train, even though to some extent we do feel like we don't know what's happening, or we don't have tools to mold it as carefully, but that it still is something that governance and policies can really help shape, and many of us can help shape with our actions.
Just because I've had a question in from the audience related to that. So you're talking about inequality and how governance can help it. One of the questions we had is, what do the panel think about the prospect of universal basic income as a replacement or supplement to waged labour? So I think
it was the hardest section of this book to write because I had to synthesise a huge amount of debate into, I think it's about less than 1,000 words. It was quite an exercise. We know that the effects of a UBI, so for those of you who don't know what a UBI is, it's this idea that a state should, or it's a contested idea, but at its core, most prescriptions suggest that the state should provide a basic level of income for citizens, highly contested who is citizens and who isn't, and that would cover a basic standard of living, pretty basic. One might call it social security, but hey. And so, and then there would be choices potentially for people to earn more than that if they can sell their labour power on the labour market. But it would provide potentially for a future where there was less employment than there is now, and I think that's why there's an interest in it in this context of the future of work. For me, that raises a lot of questions, but it raises, first of all, it starts from the premise that the future of work will include less employment, and I don't necessarily share that view. I think it's very unclear whether the future of work will create more or less employment. I mean, we've had a period of extremely high employment in this country for a very long time now, and we've, in that period of number of decades, had a number of really quite profound changes in the world of work. So that suggests that labour markets are very able to absorb change. We know that to be true. So I don't think there's necessarily any assumption that the future of work will involve fewer jobs, and particularly when we think about jobs as bundles of tasks, because tasks don't have to be put together into the same packages of jobs, and there's a lot of agency to act in that space. That said, I think there are some very interesting things about the idea that the state has a responsibility to provide a basic standard of living. I personally find a much more appetizing way of talking about that as a form of social security, because I think that comes with a set of assumptions and expectations about what our responsibilities are as citizens to pay our taxes and to elect governments that aren't going to destroy social security. But that's a separate and much, much wider debate.
Yeah, I think kind of discussions of universal basic income, they're often a bit confused, because the advocates of universal basic income often see them as a mechanism which will be very emancipatory, that you give everybody a bit of a basic income, and then people won't need to engage in paid work. It'll increase people's bargaining power. But most serious advocates for universal basic income, their main reason for being interested in it is because it operates like a negative income tax, in that basically once you start earning money, once you get a job, you'll then be taxed more, and so that money that you're getting given is actually getting taken back off you. And the reason why that's seen as very positive is because then you won't get poverty traps. So in Finland, it was trialed, and this was the aim, was to increase labour supply, not because there was a fear of a lack of jobs, but that you get these poverty traps where it doesn't make sense to work more because you'll lose your benefits. And so I think there are kind of very logical, there's kind of good reasons for having a universal basic income around making benefits work more efficiently, but I don't think it's going to be emancipatory, and I also agree with Mel that I'd go further, I don't think there will be much of a decline in paid work for the reasons that Mel says, but also the amount of jobs we have in an economy is often due to how elastic demand is. And so if we look at the textile industry, 98% of all tasks involved in the textile industry have been automated in the last 150 years. But there's more people working in the textile industry than ever before because demand has increased at a much bigger rate than that automation. And so there's likely, for services particularly, there are many areas where demand is going to be equally elastic. And even if there is a decrease in paid work, then a much simpler solution is just to reduce working time. If we reduce working time to a 4-day week, we'll all be much happier, or at least we won't be any less happy, and we'll have a lot more free time to spend with our families and do the leisure activities that we want to do, and there'll be enough work for everybody. So I think that should really be the focus.
Yeah. I also just keep an eye on who's UBI. There's not one. There are many different plans with many different visions for how this plays out. And I think right now this has gotten the attention of some bits of the tech community in the US. And so not all UBI is the same. And another way I like to think about this is, well, why are we trying, once again, a kind of privatizing solution to give people money to reduce work time, which I think both speakers have told you, may just undermine the security of work in the long term and workers' rights, when we could also be having a conversation about universal basic services. So don't let UBI stand in for all of the plans, be very critical of it, but also really do sort of investigate, would a UBI get us to a place that once again brings, a world that we want to live in. The focus of this is not to just sort of write people checks and say, well, that solved the problem of work, but actually, does this create communities? Does this create sustainable development? Does this create markets that are going to be fair and just? Does this allow people access to education? Because work is not something you want to just play around with. And I think this is what, going back to my earlier point, this sits in all of our lives in such a completely important way that it's not just about labor markets and the stats of labor. This is about our values, our lives, our families. I mean, it really goes to so much more. It shapes our life. So if we start to tweak that and play around with it in these experiments without really understanding what we're doing, I think we might miss a larger boat there.
Yeah, really, really important points, definitely. And while I would really agree that it's really difficult to see whether employment is going to reduce or increase or what's going to happen or how to even forecast that, I believe that some of the estimates that have come out over the last year or two about the UK in particular are expecting, though, that in the short term there's going to be some winners and some losers from automation. And perhaps in the longer term there might still be an increase in employment, but there's going to be some type of disparate impacts with winners and losers. So this is for the UK, and then globally you do have a similar situation. And we have a slightly similar section in our report of just talking about what are some of the governance mechanisms to start dealing with this. And obviously this might look very, very different around the world. Again, we're talking about the UK and kind of with our specific labor market institutions. But there might be very different solutions depending on whether you're a social democracy or a completely different governance system. And again, having a global discussion about many of these options as people are facing slightly similar situations around the world might be rise for very, very interesting solutions there. However, I think what really needs to happen and what seems to be the suggestion even for some of the emerging economies where you don't necessarily have a similar welfare state is that social partners should enter into a dialogue and start making sure that there is a safety net for those who are going to be losing out in the short term, as that's very likely to happen around the world.
So should we talk about skills? Let's talk about skills and what skills are going to be needed in the future of work. Who wants to?
Well, I think the answer is we don't know, and so but we've never known. That's the point. And so a good skills and vocational training system does is it gets the stakeholders together to bargain and negotiate what a good outcome is for whatever sort of time horizon they can legitimately plan for. So so if we think, there are sectors in the UK that do this, there are many institutions in other countries, particularly Northern European countries, which do this very systematically. And stakeholders are sometimes employers and unions. They're often involving the state as well, because the state often pays for part of the skills development, particularly in the early stages of someone's career, or in reskilling if someone's skills become redundant partway through their career and they need to their working life and they need to retrain. So the state has a lot at stake as well. So there are usually good systems that are able to plan. Typically involve some sort of forum where those parties can sit down and work out a sensible time horizon, which is typically rarely longer than about 5 years, because none of us can see much further ahead than that, and work out where the skills demands are going and say, well, okay, we can do this for the short to medium term, but we know in the longer term we don't know what healthcare is going to look like. We don't know what skills we're going to need for healthcare. We don't know what skills we're going to need in universities. We don't know what skills we're going to need in motor manufacturing or sandwich production or whatever it is. What we do know is that if we keep talking to each other about ways that we can make changes that incorporate the interests of all the stakeholders, then we're going to come out with systems that everyone is kind of bought into to some extent. It means nobody falls off that cliff edge if they're 50 and their skills become redundant. And so you have to have mechanisms for those people, because it will happen to us, maybe. And we need systems where those people can be retrained, redeployed, and not just go into a state where they have no options. That is not provided for by education that people pay for, sadly. That paying for education and skills training is the single worst way, single way of ensuring you cannot have that system.
In addition to that, I think also there's more of a role for the government to play in the demand side for skills. And so in the UK, we've now got this situation. So there's a survey called the Skills and Employment Survey, and you can see that our qualifications, our workforce is becoming more skilled, but skill use in the workplace over my lifetime, it was increasing, but it's now started to stagnate and even decline in some types of skills which are needed. So our economy it doesn't automatically create jobs which need a skilled workforce. And if we think about kind of technology, this kind of makes sense that when computerization was first taking place, then there was all these new skills that we needed to learn. But now programs are becoming more routine, easier to use, it's less complex to use those processes. And so I think rather than just focusing on the supply side, of the creation of a skilled workforce and hoping that there'll be jobs for which will utilize those skills, we also need industrial policy which creates jobs where people can utilize those skills, can have complexity in their work and find it intrinsically interesting.
That's interesting. You're talking about people finding work interesting. And one of the questions we've had is what could be done to make work more enjoyable and fulfilling?
Wow. Work is a bit rubbish, isn't it? What I always sort of start, like probably everyone else on the panel, I spend a lot of time talking to undergrads about work, and many of them don't have work experience. Some of them do, but many of them don't. And a lot of them have come from the kind of background where their parents do relatively interesting jobs. They're not typically these days from the kind of supermarket, families where their families might be, say, working a supermarket in a very boring job, or a factory in a very boring job. So they tend to be, around them, the adults they know tend to have relatively interesting jobs. And I think this is a real problem in the policy community as well. Policy gets made by people who have interesting jobs, like me, like policy advisors in Downing Street or whoever. And we forget that the vast majority of our jobs are not that interesting. Work is a bit rubbish for most people. My work is pretty damned interesting, and my work is a bit rubbish when you're marking the 30th essay of the day, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. It's kind of not the point of work to some extent. And I think we would have to think about work in such a different way. We'd have to think of it beyond the capital system, really, to move to any profoundly different, which isn't to say we shouldn't be interested in job quality, because we should, and interesting work and work that's varied, work that you have some sort of control over, is definitely, we know that people who have those kind of jobs tend to rate their jobs better. That doesn't mean those people like their jobs every day of the week. You know, two different things.
I actually think this is one of the sort of mysteries at the moment for social scientists to go figure out, because you have this long conversation around meaningful, the history here of what work should be, and meaningful work is a history also of struggle and liberation and organizing. And I always think that the gig economy, in all of its difficulties and precarity and risk, and in a truly troubling legal model for the future, also is predicated on some desire for work to be better. For people to have flexibility, which of course has become this buzzword that platforms use in order to kind of smear over labor laws and to smear over municipalities and say, well, everybody wants to work flexibly. It turns out that people do, but they want also to work fairly. That doesn't mean they want to work for nothing. Doesn't mean they want to have no health insurance or no pensions or protections. And I always think that we haven't done a very good job of linking up the longer histories there around work-life balance, around maternity care, around women's arguments in the workplace, to understand what kind of got us to that moment around the new economy. People want it out of work. They do want it to be better. And it's almost like this is the endless process of how do we collectivize that desire? What do we do with it? It's, in many ways, I agree with you, there's a panic. We're all going to be unemployed, and it makes us feel very insecure. But we're sitting in a really interesting moment. This is why I always bring the classroom back, because there is a world to be built there. It might not look like a world that we currently live in, but we can change this. We can think about ourselves as laborers who make things at every level. And the dream of mine, truly, is to bring labor history together with digital sociology. And rather than producing kids who want to go out and have a entrepreneurial startup and become a billionaire, I would love for someone to take this up really seriously, that what you make is real, and it has ramifications for communities, for culture, for the rest of us, and for the future. I mean, that, to me, is what the social sciences should be investing money in, right? And it's teaching, really. So, sorry.
And so I'm going to click on to what should we do about the future.
Yeah.
Lovely, fantastically, you segued us into that. And also you've been talking about the gig economy. We've sort of touched on it a little bit. What should we be doing for the future of work? Well, the gig economy is like quite a new thing in our economy. What should we be looking at in the future?
So, in my view, we need to regulate work, and we can only do that in a collective manner. And so we do need to be very clear about when people sell their labour, that is a form of work that they should have some rights attached to. So there are, in UK law, for example, there are some definitional issues about including who is a worker. So I think there are some very practical, very immediate things that we could change tomorrow to define a worker, and therefore who has rights to a national minimum wage, to holidays, to various other rights. But that's not enough. We need to have a system that we can then enforce those rights. And we have a collective employment tribunal system, which is quite frankly failing at the moment. It just doesn't have the capacity to deal with the kind of demands on it. So we need, you have no rights if you have no way of enforcing your rights. So we need a system of enforcing our rights. And that's dealing with our individual rights as individual workers. But much more profoundly, we need collective voice, because if we don't have a say, if as workers we are not equal partners in shaping what the future of work looks like, we will always have the much more negative effects. It will be shaped in the interests of our employers by definition. And at the moment, there are so many constraints on re-establishing that collective voice, that looking at that area, I think, is the most important. I would say that when I was trained as a union organiser. So.
Karen?
Yeah, I'm sorry, gathering my thoughts. If anyone else wants to jump in there for a second.
Alex, you ready?
I'm trying to think
Should
of something different to say to Mel.
Well, I've got a question from the
sure.
audience which relates to this, which is about what changes. So, if we were talking about collective voice, what changes would you propose to how labour is priced in the labour market if you did have that collective voice?
I don't think it's necessarily about pricing. There are some issues about minimum wages and who they apply to and how they apply. That's less of a concern to me when we're looking at those broader questions of worker voice. I think it's much more about what our work looks like and how these changes will be negotiated or not, whether they'll just be imposed on us. And I think we're in a space where for most of us, they are just being imposed on us. And I think that may have effects on how labour markets work. That's not primarily where I'm coming from. And I don't think we've got anyone who's primarily trained as a labour economist on the panel. But if there are people who want to speak to that in more detail, for me, it's much more about what work looks like. And obviously that can then have effects on the pricing of labour, but that's a secondary issue as far as I'm concerned. I mean, obviously work has to pay to some extent, but... So in sociology of work, it's often seen as there being kind of employment being comprised of two elements, kind of the market relationship and then the managerial relationship. And so your experiences at work aren't just about what's happening in the market, but also in the workplace where your potential to do the work is actually being transformed into the actual work and labour and the production of whatever it is that you're producing to create a profit. And so I think it's very important that people are being paid enough to live on, but also there's all these issues of job quality and work organisation, which are kind of separate issues. And going back to the previous question on meaningful work, this is something that I've been looking at, is the degree to which people feel that their job is useful. And we were looking at this because David Graeber claims a very large percentages of people believe their jobs aren't useful. And so we looked at a big data set which asked people, is your job useful? And we found only 5% of people said their job wasn't useful. And Graeber said that's because these people really know, they really know that their jobs aren't useful. But what we actually found, what's associated with feeling your job isn't useful, is having a bad manager who makes you feel like your job isn't useful. It's feeling rushed, so you don't have enough time to do a good job. It's not having discretion over the work and the choices that you're making in doing that job. And so we really think it's much more about alienation and not having a voice in the workplace, rather than that jobs are being created which are actually not useful. And so, yeah, again, I'd agree with Mel that it's about organisation, having a collective voice over the way in which the work organisation takes place.
There's also just the point that some of what Alex just mentioned, when people don't understand how work is organized or how decisions are made, and here's where the algorithms and the kind of invisible bosses, or who I have no boss, but somehow the metrics are shaping my life, we are starting to see that causes unrest. People get frustrated. There's emotional concerns there. There's mental well-being. People are confused. They get frustrated. But in all of that, they also start talking to each other. So even though people, and Alex can probably talk about this a bit more, even though there's been a long-standing thought that, these workers have been atomized and they'll never see each other and it's going to be hard to organize, some of this, a bit about this gig economy and about the frustrations that people are having, leads to people talking to one another, leads to new forms of solidarity. And I don't think it's actually that surprising that we've seen really some militant organizing happening around Deliveroo and Uber and these new forms, because people are having to find ways to talk to one another precisely about this issue that Alex just, what's going on? How do I do this job? How do I do it well? Oh my God, there's nobody to call for help. So workers are finding each other. And I think that if the I always think gig platforms are data platforms and they're going to pivot. They're not wealthy because they deliver you a cheeseburger. They're wealthy because they understand cities in a new way, which will become quite valuable. And I think, we can footnote that because trade unions need to come back to that and think about data leverage. But yeah, at the most basic level, these jobs are frustrating, and it leads to conversations, and those conversations have, in a very short span of time, turned to formal organizing, which I think is fascinating. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the other question that we've got on here is what impact does the facelessness of corporate employees and the lack of real decision-making power of middle managers have on staff? And I think you've just answered that perfectly. It's really interesting.
Yeah, maybe just to diversify from those viewpoints and to kind of look at something very tangible and particular in terms of the what should we be doing about this? So I'm going to give a couple of examples that have to do with AI in the UK in particular, and then kind of the distributional impact of that. So I think that it's really important as we have these continuing technological changes and AI and introduction of AI being one of the leading ones in the UK right now, that we kind of study these topics, understand them, and then we have very particular policy responses as we understand what's going on. So for instance, there was a recent study that was looking at the impact of AI in terms of kind of endangering jobs in certain areas in the UK. And you have certain industries, for instance, like health and education and professional services, which are standing to gain in terms of jobs, according to these predictions, while you have others, like for instance, public administration or transportation, that perhaps stand to lose in certain regions of the UK in particular. So if you do see a pattern like that, you can analyze it with data science, let's see, then respond to that with social science, understanding that better, and then having distributional policies to even perhaps encourage the use of AI in these industries to increase productivity, but then to be dealing with this distributional impact and having the social safety net for anyone who is losing out in the short term. And then the other example that I do personally find really interesting is women in AI and in data science, because we're just starting to really study this in the UK. We've done a little bit of this in the US. What seems to be the case is that you have fewer women entering into this field, and you do have them dropping out of it sooner than the male counterparts do. And this is clearly a really big problem, because if you do develop technological solutions, the person who is developing is going to inherently really impact the way that that technological solution works. So it's a big problem if it's only a certain group of society that is developing these kind of solutions. So there was a study, I think, over the World Economic Forum that found this industry gender gap in AI for women using LinkedIn data. And they found that it really amplified the gap that you already have in STEM skills and then in retraining over these emerging skills. And a couple of specific policy responses that they recommended was just increasing the opportunities for reskilling, and then also making sure that there are transition pathways for jobs. So to start really looking at particular problems, particular slices of the pie that we would call the future of work, and then having particular responses to those.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so we've been talking for quite a long time, so I'm gonna. I've done all of the questions that I've got on the Mentimeter, but we do have a mic around, so I don't know if anybody else has any questions that they'd like to ask. Please put your hand up and wait for the mic to come to you.
Yeah, could I just ask you to kind of reflect on the future of work and climate change? I was kind of writing a short list here and thinking that maybe that is something that is going to increasingly kind of press on this agenda.
I mean, I think it's very clear that there are an awful lot of jobs potentially in transitioning to a greener economy. We've got an awful lot of work to do to implement huge social changes and produce new stuff in different ways, and reorganize a whole set of activities and products, and the production of those products and where they're produced and all sorts of things. I don't see it as necessarily for example, we're all going to start producing vegetables in our back garden and stuff like that. But I think it's very clear we have to think the demands on our employers that will increasingly be made to change the way they do business, whether that's service business or producing, but especially producing things, is inevitably going to change. Not just what's produced, but how it's produced and how it's then transported as well. And I think at the moment we're assuming patterns of value change, global value change, which rely heavily on international transportation. I think there are some real questions about the level to which that's sustainable. And you could imagine a future, fly a kite, where production is reshored into much, much closer proximity to the end use. I don't know. But it's clear. What's not clear to me is that, for example, climate change is going to lead to such a rapid breakdown of existing systems that necessarily jobs will be lost. That might happen, but I think there are many other futures, possible futures. I don't know. Thoughts?
Yeah, maybe just to contextualize that, definitely a huge factor in all of this. In our report, we actually kind of had a little discussion on what are the drivers in the future of work. And we did characterize climate change as one of those because it really does have impacts on so many other things, even in terms of just technological innovation, but trade and demographic change, and as that then interacts with climate change. So huge, huge factor, and very difficult to see kind of where in this complex set of interactions kind of particular moving part is pushing another moving part.
Okay, I've just realised that I had a technological issue and there are more questions. So I don't know if anyone else has any, otherwise I'm going to read one here, but please put your hand up if you've got another question you'd like to ask, which is, let's say there's a depression in the next 5 years, like a 1930s one. A depression. How would that change the future of the job market?
I go back to the answer. We don't know.
Yeah.
So when I was asked to write this book, I was starting from the assumption we don't know, and it would be extremely dumb to make, solid predictions. What we do know is kind of where we are now and how we got there, and we know where some of the moving parts are, and so we can say that any future, whether it's a prosperous one or a depressed one, will create pressures on employers in different sectors, combined with climate change and many other things, global value chains, all sorts of things, will create pressures on the stakeholders, primarily employers and employees, and that they will be trying to work out what works for them. And most of our work that is transmitted to us with relatively little say as employees. So what we can reasonably assume, certainly in the UK, is that the transmission of those shocks, those changes, those moving parts, is likely to get transmitted as our employers' interests in responding to those. And that's my fundamental starting point in thinking about it. I don't think that's a great idea, but it kind of is where we are in 2019. So that's not quite answering the question, but I'm kind of coming from a slightly different question. I'm not trying to predict how this is going to play out. I'm commenting on the processes that will lead to whatever ends up being like in 5 years' time, 10 years' time.
I just want to say also, coming to the UK from the US, when I first arrived here, I think there was this sense that the state is not your friend.
Yes.
The state in the US is not a good actor, it's not going to help you with these questions. And there was a sort of reasonable UK response, calm down, American, laws will fix it. And even as you can hear in all of our responses, we are kind of reliant on a reasonable state, one that functions in some kind of social contract of reasonability. And I think it's interesting to have these conversations in the UK at this moment, where we're not quite sure. I mean, I don't know. I actually don't know what's going on, and I don't necessarily know that we trust the state to usher us through this moment. So I think it's...
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm going to wrap it up shortly, but I'm going to ask you some sort of quick fire answers to the questions that got 2 or more votes on them. So Alex, like you mentioned the 4-day working week. One of the questions is, what do you think of the Labour Party's desire to move to a 4-day working week?
Yeah, rapid fire. So I think it's not radical enough. I think we should actually be aiming much bigger reductions in working time. And so my old supervisor at Cambridge, his research shows that actually if you just work 4 hours a week, if you control for income, then there's no benefit to working for your mental health, for your well-being, of working longer weeks. And so if the productivity gains that we've had since the 1960s had have been translated into reductions of working time rather than consumption, I'm going back to climate change, which is unsustainable, then we would already have a big reduction in working time. But we need regulation in order to achieve that, so people aren't kind of continue to compete by working longer hours. So.
Yeah. And I think we need to understand working time as a highly socially constructed notion. My master's thesis was on the campaign for the 35-hour week in engineering sector, somewhat unsuccessful campaign, but a very interesting one. We've long had these arguments about working time. It's really important when we come to them, we don't assume there's a lump of labour, so we don't assume that just reducing the number of hours we work will necessarily increase the number of jobs available. That would be my immediate headline answer.
Okay, and then the next question I've got is, do native English speakers have an unfair advantage in the global employment market?
Yeah.
Well,
A lot of my research looks at these kind of global platforms similar to Sana's research, and definitely being a native English speaker is a big advantage, and also workers themselves in the global south, even if they are kind of a native English speaker, but they're not from the UK or the US, and they also feel very disadvantaged, and that they face discrimination based on that language, both from other workers in the global north, but also from clients as well. And Sana, you might have more to say.
Yeah, I would say that would be the broad pattern, but then at the same time, for instance, on these global platforms, sometimes you might have specific work demand for a certain administrative system or perhaps certain services in that administrative system, and then you would have that nationality that would be kind of the preferred person for the job. So, but I would say that on the very larger scale, definitely native English speakers. Yeah.
With a slightly different hat on, I'm doing some work with the Malawian Education Department for Education about skills, language policy and skills development. They have about 12 languages, 2 official languages, and then a set of local languages. And they've just moved to a policy of teaching their primary school children in English with exactly this rationale. The problem is all the evidence from teaching tells us that if you kind of have to teach primary school kids in their first language, in their home language, the language they use in their home, in order for them to be able to develop the key skills to then go on to learn other languages and the basics of maths and all the other skills that they need. It's a highly controversial policy. The government has done it for very good reasons. They've done it to try and position Malawi in this international labour market. But I think we're seeing on the ground the real challenges of doing that in a setting where the teachers are not necessarily confident with their own language skills, where they don't have the infrastructure of the books, for example, the textbooks, etc. So there's a whole lot of things that go into that that play out in very interesting ways.
Okay, this is going to be our last question. How closely is the future of work tied to the future of capitalism?
Work will always exist. And this is where we go back to Alex's key distinction at the beginning. And work will always exist. We will always have work to do. How we're paid for it, whether we leave the workplace to go and sell our labour power that's then transformed into something through a process of management and various other controls, that is deeply embedded in capitalism. I don't think anyone disagrees with that.
Yeah, no.
Great closing quote.
Yeah. Okay, well, with that, please join me in thanking our panellists so much.